If you're here, you already sense there's something out there, something magical and mysterious, just waiting for you to find. And you've probably already discovered it isn't as easy as just thinking happy thoughts. You're not alone. Generations of shamans, philosophers, seers, and scientists have pursued this eternal quest. Where their ideas come together, you'll find powerful tools to cultivate magic and self-mastery in your own life. Welcome to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. I'm your host, Donna Woodwell. I'm a former journalist and author, a master astrologer, and a hermetic initiate, and it's my honor to be your guide. In each episode, I'll meet you at the crossroads of science and spirit, reason and intuition, to help you discover the wisdom that works for you. Are you ready? The adventure awaits. Welcome back to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. This is episode 22 about non-attachment. I am so ready to dive into this week's episode of the Magic and Mastery Podcast because Chris has gotten a great story and a great idea. So we're going to be talking about non-attachment and all of its related things like, desire and craving and all that kind of fun stuff. But Chris, I want to turn it over to you so you can set the stage for our conversation today.
Thank you, Donna. It's great to see you and be here with you again. And hello, everyone listening. Yeah, this is a topic I've been thinking about quite often. I'm sure Donna has as well throughout time.
Well, ever since you told me we were going to record an episode on it.
And and then this is one of the fundamental, for me, basis of magic. Basically existence as well. I mean, we can start off a little bit this is one: attachment and desire. We talk about in the Buddhist context. It's one of the noble truths, and that all existence is fundamentally based on and rooted towards suffering, which is linked to attachment, especially on the material plane, and how we are attached to our physical bodies, how we're attached to even these ideological concepts of the self. And these are all things that, especially on starting off on a magic path, that you really have to surrender and open up to wider possibilities as you're kind of crafting your own cosmology and doing a sort of self-experiential navigation and understanding of life and the universe, which we're all doing individually and uniquely, yet intimately connected. And this was coming up quite big. We just had the lunar eclipse. For those knowing astrology, Saturn was stationed retrograde right on my sun, and this was kind of coming up for me quite a bit. Just this notion of mortality, time, space, how we're attached to. All
right, we got to spit out the rest of this story, Chris.
Okay.
I know what it is because I can see you.
Yes, so for a very long time, I had long hair, and I cut it off yesterday, actually. Totally cut it off. And and it feels great. I'm happy about it. I'm glad I went through with it. But it was an interesting process leading up to it. And it was a total, am I ready for this initiation? All the little vain things of attaching to the body were popping up, the vain things of how do I look and how's it going to go? Because I'm hair was thinning, balding, and just I was kind of done with it. But then sitting with it as well was so I'm attached to this I'm attached to this look. I'm attached to this, even the concepts that, the hair holds power. I still have my beard and the beard's not going away. But all these little conceptions and how you built up this persona, then I'm thinking all the times I could have just let my hair down, ignoring all the nonsense of how difficult it was and hot and tangly. And you have to, everyone out there with with hair knows you have to tend it, which I'm lazy, don't like to do. So this was nice and liberating, but it was an interesting process to go into where, just recognizing that level of attachment and then also the fundamental nature of time and letting, we're all going to die. We're all attached to this body, and that ultimate fear of letting go and surrender which also comes in any moment of initiation where you're fundamentally altered and changed when you step into that. Like even like Donna, I'm sure you can uh, can relate to this, but like when you're going into like a ceremonial work, you know it starts beforehand, like that whole build up leading into ceremony, and then when you go in, that build up is that initiation moment. And like it doesn't matter if it's your first time or it's, you know, it's like your 100th ceremony or things like that. You know, each time you're walking in there, and there's going to be a fundamental shift, whether it's something drastic and that you're, you know, it's really readily noticeable the day after, or a little nugget that's sort of like seated in your consciousness that starts to blossom years down the road. You know, that doesn't really matter, but that is a fundamental fork in the road. You know, like when you go in, and then after go in and going into ceremony, then you're in ceremony, then it's over, you're fundamentally altered. And those are like the initiation moments. And what we're talking about a couple weeks ago, even threshold guardians, you know, those are those moments when you're faced with some sort of trial, some sort of pregnant moment where everything is going to be drastically changed. So that is also that, you know, rooted into attachment. Like we go in there with fear that, you know, things maybe are going to be different, or maybe fear that things aren't going to be different. Either way, those are kind of linked towards, like, we're rooted in these concepts of ourselves or things we want to change in our lives. And I think that's a fundamental root of magic, is letting go of our attachments, whether it's something physical or something like we are going to die, or something just like we have this belief that's kind of been built around our consciousness for so long that needs to be dismantled. And then you're kind of opening up into this wider expanse. And that's my little nutshell introduction towards what we're going to be talking about.
I got a secret. A number of years ago, I dated someone who was a practicing Buddhist. He used to talk about non-attachment all the time.
Yeah.
I truly developed a dislike for even the concept of non-attachment, because it wasn't long after I had given birth, and I'm like, I'm attached to my child.
Mm-hmm.
If you take my child away, if my child dies, I am going to be seriously suffering. So my response was, some suffering is simply what I'm willing to do for the privilege of having people that I love in my life. It is a difficulty that I'm willing to accept for the privilege of being in relationship. And so everything should be non-attached. I want to be attached to anything seemed to me just as unhealthy as the codependent kind of relationship. So I actually spent some time talking to my own magical teacher about it. And she said, well, maybe think about it a little differently. Rather than using the word non-attachment, which is really loaded, especially in certain religious circles and in New Age circles, think of it as at heart. There are two basic primary movements in life, even from the smallest little amoeba to, things far more complicated than humans. There's a movement toward, and there's a movement away. And that the movement toward we can loosely call desire, motivated by pleasure, whatever else moves us toward something. And moving away, we can loosely call avoidance or release, moving away from something. And that everything in human experience could be generally classified in one of those two things. Because if human experience doesn't have those motions, away, toward and away, we would just be sitting in a room of blankness, which might be peaceful and it might be refreshing, but it's not human. Humans, we want things. We desire things. We avoid things. That's what creates all of our karmic mess that we're in. And so learning how to skillfully navigate what we want to move toward and what we want to move away from is an art that the magician learns, because every desire is a construction, every Every avoidance is a construction. And the true master of oneself understands that and uses them accordingly. So it's a great quote from The Discovery of Witches, which I just watched not very long ago, that said, "Magic is desire made manifest." And in a sense, that's what we're talking about. Is there are things that we want. It's the Western way to want things. It's the Eastern way to sort of let go of things so that we can reduce the suffering in our lives. But the Western path has traditionally been this thing that I want, how do I get it? And the two of them taken together balance each other out. Now, the Eastern path helps us to release because we need to release, otherwise our lives would be filled with stuff, as I'm figuring out, as I'm cleaning up my house this weekend. But if we don't create, if we don't desire and therefore create, why are we having a human experience? So they need each other. But I do understand how hard it is to try to navigate those fields. How very hard, they're so pregnant when you get down in there and start researching, what people have studied about it, what makes people willing to release versus willing to move towards something, how desire is constructed within, how desire is constructed by Madison Avenue. All of those things come into play, and it gets very, very complicated.
It really does, and I'm glad you brought that up, because actually that concept and definition of non-attachment is what I would perceive as detachment. So when I'm talking about non-attachment, I'm thinking more of a heart-centered awareness that things are going to pass, but you love anyway. You're going to get hurt. There's going to be suffering, but you love anyway. You live with that open heart where you are having that full direct experience of life, yet not being like so invested or numbing yourself, becoming callous and not feeling and withdrawing completely. So it's like super nuanced. I feel like non-attachment versus detachment. And obviously, I can contributing a polarity of positive or negative with it. But that's something that I've been thinking about quite often too over the years, is that nuanced, subtle difference between detached and non-attachment. Because you're absolutely right. Like that was actually one of my biggest problems with of Buddhism too, is that full withdrawal and non-action, and just not participating in life. That never sat well with me either. But then there was more nuance to that, like where you're fully engaged in life, yet sort of unattached towards like manipulating outcomes completely. Like obviously, like what you said about the Western view of magic, of fulfilling desire, totally important. But then it's like, what actually, I do feel like there's this level where we get like what you said, the Madison Avenue sort of approach. Like we're doing like the law of attraction to like get our fancy car, get all these material like gains and things like that inevitably are going to just disappear anyway. So if we're fully kind of like invested and attached to that, then like that is the path that leads to suffering in that regard. Like that over investment towards these, I'm going to be working an 80-hour work day, and then, for, X amount of years, so I can theoretically have this, grand retirement in some theoretical abstract future and enjoy my life, rather than taking those moments to enjoy your life during. And then also like, I can't be happy without having X amount of funds or love in my life and things like that. Always looking externally to find some sort of self-fulfillment. And that's when I see like the difference between non-attachment and detachment. It's neither good or bad, but like that overinvestment that does lead to this perpetual.
I do have a lot of respect for Buddhism now that I actually knew more than I did 15 years ago. That I like their concept of craving, because to me it sounds a little more manageable in my Western point of view.
Yeah.
That craving and grasping is the kinds of attachment where you're like the monkey's paw, like you've got your hand on the thing and you can't relax and let go. And so it's not respecting the yin and yang, the back and forth. It's not respecting the process of desire that comes and goes. And okay, when you told me we were talking about this, I did a little bit of research. I can't help myself. I just did a little bit well, I can, but I desire to do a little bit of research. And therefore I gave into it because it was pleasurable, which comes back to the other part of why we have desires, why we like having them fulfilled. That people that there's a tons of research that a practice of non-attachment leads to all kinds of medical benefits. Actually, better proven medical benefits than mindfulness, which surprised me. That because it reduces, as you say, suffering, as the Buddha figured out. Because we don't have expectations that are unfulfilled. We don't have that feeling of ripping away and loss the way we would ordinarily. We don't have that anger and resentment for whatever we have constructed in our heads. But there are two ways to get there, at least for most people. And the number one way is the old-fashioned let's meditate way. Because when you meditate and you watch your desires rise and fall, you realize just like everything else, they rise and they fall. And they don't have to be big desires. They don't have to be big desires for like, I need a new car. They have to be even little ones, like I need to scratch my nose.
Yeah, exactly. Or even the thought process itself, like not like gripping and attaching to one concept during that, letting it drift by.
And so when you're meditating, you are learning how to take that observer point of view. You are learning how to, at least in certain types of meditation, you are learning to watch the flow of your thoughts come and go, your desires come and go, and everything comes and goes. So that's one way to get the benefits of the non-attachment point of view. The other way, it was people who've been through really difficult traumas. Had some serious realignments in their life and realized that everything can go. You can lose everything at an instant. How do you rebuild yourself after this? So there are people who have been through like a post-traumatic growth process because there's something about tragedy that makes us appreciate life in a different way. And so I think it's sad that humans sometimes need that kind of difficulty. And yet, in the big picture, people ask all the time, how can we live in a world where the cosmos allows bad things to happen to good people? And it's like, well, why are we here in the big picture? And if we can learn how to take the difficult moments and to turn them into something magical, isn't that part of the process of learning how to soften? And as you said, it becomes a kind of detached compassion for self and a detached compassion for other people. You become less judgmental and you become more selective on what you do attach to as more of a conscious choice rather than a knee-jerk reaction. Like, have you ever seen someone panic? I know, I was in lifeguard training, so I went through a lot of scenarios. But sometimes when people get tossed in the water, they panic, especially if they don't know how to swim, and they're flailing about and they're grabbing onto anything. And you have to be really careful when you go in after them not to get caught in the flailing, because chances are you'll both drown. So you have to learn how to present, the paddle or the boat hook or whatever else you're swimming out with yourself to hand them and then gently pull them in and don't get caught in the backlash. Well, that's what our inner child is doing when it's attaching to, it's flailing. It's flailing because it doesn't have a sense of center. It doesn't have a sense of ground. And so everything becomes something to try to fill the void within. And Chris and I both went to journalism and communication school. So we had our own ways of going. I went through propaganda school. I literally went through propaganda school. You can use that knowledge about humans, that they feel empty, and you can construct needs that never existed before. And so all kinds of things. You walk into the grocery store and half the stuff on the shelf, it's not a need. It's a constructed desire that we think that we need to have because we grew up with it, because someone told us like it. Heck, you can be from another country that lives at a different level of modernity and walk into an American grocery store and go like, what is it with you people? There's 16 varieties of a widget that you don't need, or take your pick. I mean, we didn't use deodorant. We didn't use leg shavers. We didn't use all kinds of things in the not too far distant past. And someone decided, as they say in that West Wing episode, the quote from the guy, the campaign manager, he's like, it's like P.T. Barnum. I can sell anything. White salmon, guaranteed not to go pink. And just by twisting the logic and playing on your feelings of lack and insecurity, all of a sudden you go struggling to find something to fill up the void, whatever that is. I'm not sure you can even, I don't think you can completely avoid it. You can just manage it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think that's also that fundamental desire for spirit to return to source. That's that fundamental longing. And it's the same thing in romantic partnerships. We're always, looking for that other to kind of complete the self, within that union, that fragmentary parts of ourselves, piecing those together. And I feel like that's also another realm where you can see this really strongly. And it takes a lot of, all life and just going about your day takes a great amount of courage with those grand concepts. Like everything is going to end. Your loved ones are going to part. Like that. We're just like satellites caught in orbit of each other, and some are longer duration than others, and some we're meeting strangers in the street and we'll never see them again. And that's a beautiful thing too, this whole transient nature, because it kind of like, in that context, when we're not kind of latching on to, and to that fear that we're going to be either alone or we're going to lose this person, you can really just kind of appreciate that time you're spending with someone, and love fully in that moment, fully open-hearted, with knowing that knowledge that, that suffering is there. And I think that's a courageous thing that we all do. And that can be in with anything, that's love is that primordial force. It's always there, but it's always centered within us. And so like embracing the joy when we have joy, and understanding still that there's suffering happen in the world. It's not, simultaneously everyone is just having like this Ewok party after the Death Star blows up. It's not always happening simultaneously. So it's gives great honor, I think, to the suffering that is happening, to like embrace those joyous moments, to live fully in the present. And yeah, you know what I mean?
I when I'm teaching students, when we're actually talking about doing magic, it takes people a while to get over it takes more time to get over all the hangups involved in the process than it does the actual process itself. The process is actually really straightforward because it is our natural birthright to create. But I remember, I think people underestimate how much of our energy and desires are crystallized in everything that we have around us. And that's just the physical kickable stuff. I'm not even talking about the ideas, which are a whole nother range, but let's just talk about the physical kickable stuff. So I remember going to a ceremonial circle, and it was on the art of manifestation. My teacher loved to work around the wheel. So we would do different exercises at different parts of the year or in different things so that we were keeping it balanced all the way around. So this just happened to be the weekend, the 3-day weekend on manifestation. And so we did 6 ceremonies over the course of the weekend, and we were talking a lot about what it is to manifest things. And so Friday night, we did our first ceremony, and then we talked about if you could manifest anything, let's manifest something in the north part of the wheel and the south part of the wheel and the west part of the wheel and so on, what would it be? And people picked, there's half a dozen people in the class. They all picked different things. But I had just gotten to Texas, and I decided that I wanted a truck. Because, Texans need trucks. That's what we have, right? But I didn't want a big truck. I wanted a little baby truck. Little tiny baby truck. And so I put this on the north of my wheel, and it would be a white truck because white was for the north. The north moves things, and I needed a new car anyway because I was driving around my younger brother's hand-me-down from high school, and seriously, we called it the Chugmobile for a reason. It was not good. So I put that on my thing, and we sat in circle, and we charged it up with spirit energy. And I came home that night and didn't think anything of it until there was a knock on the door at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And some drunk person had, in the middle of the night, fell asleep at the wheel, jumped the curb, and smashed their car into both of our cars where they sat in the driveway. And both of the cars were mangled up like a lawn ornament so that all the cops from the local community were driving by all day long. They had to get a crane to pry them apart from the tree and each other and haul them away. So when it was time to go back to ceremony, I had nothing to drive. Nothing. So I had to call someone in class and say, well, please come and get me because apparently I'm going to get my truck. And it was illustrative for what I learned about the art of manifestation and being clear and all of those kinds of things. But it was also illustrative because having a big part of your life, even if you don't think of it as a big part of your life, like both of your cars removed violently, you feel the emptiness, the vacancy where the thing was. But that's just pointing out how much psychic energy we have invested, even in the smallest things of our lives, which is why it can be so complicated to get people to let go of things, why there's television shows about people who've hoarded things for years, because they don't understand the art of releasing things back into the flow. And so they collect and they collect and they collect. And yet we don't need really much of it at all. All of it. I mean, even my cars. I needed it more then, before we had like Uber, but they're not essential to life. You can live a full life without even a fraction of the stuff that we hold on to. And that's just the physical stuff. What about all the mental stuff? I've called it duckweed before. All the mental duckweed that we like clog up our brains with, and what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, and who said what to whom, and what they said on Facebook or what they said on the news. All of that's duckweed too. And yet, once we start pulling it out, if we give away everything that we own, if we release all of our thoughts and all of our opinions and all of our judgments, we are left with a blank slate, which might be freeing, but we can't sit in the blank slate and be human. So the question is, how do you build it back to something that is using desire skillfully to move yourself through time, which is what it is. I mean, desire moves forwards, release moves backwards. Map that on to the movement of time. We are being pulled by desire into the future, and we are releasing and avoiding you can't separate time and desire. Try. I dare you, but you can't. Anyway, that was a lot. That was a perfect example, and also another example is popping in my head now that I have to be non-attached to everything that I want to reply as you're continuing, because just layer and layer of these thought bombs that are totally true. You can have the next 10 minutes are all yours.
No, I appreciate it. Where to begin? I'll start backward here, because that's one thing too. You're absolutely right that like when we are absolutely you painted this vision, this visual that after everything is released and gone, then we're sitting in this like voided sort of non-space, and that kind of reminds me of like the whole influx outflux of the universe and stuff, the whole contraction expansion of the universe, the mind of the great dreamer dreaming the reality, and then the dreamer wakes up and everything sort of vanishes and disappears, or that thought concept of the the original thought that, you know, gave birth to word and sound and rippled off in creation, and then that inevitable comeback, right? And then you have to create again. It's like dream new dreams and new creation. So I feel like that was very primordial and important. And then okay, you're two things you touched on in your anecdote about the ceremony of manifestation. One, we have to get back to is the precision of intention setting during those things. Like you have to be super precise because and also be not attached with your outcome then if you're not precise, because it can come in super weird, interesting ways.
And fast.
And fast. But the other thing that you mentioned, which is so crucial for that, is after that act, the ceremony rite is complete, the manifestation is set, is the letting go of all that thought attached to that ceremony, to surrender it to the void and trust and faith that this act it's going to return, it's going to work out. And that's a big thing that I come across of any like magical literature, is always that don't think about the act after it's done. It's done, it's gone, let it go. And I feel like that's crucial. That's a crucial part of non-attachment in a magical context, is to let go of all that intention we built up in the rite, surrender, release it outward, and not then overplayed in our minds, because then like that thought web, that thought current starts to interfere and can, like, you know, bounce around and kind of manipulate and this malleable sort of energy that's happening. And it's a tough one, because we always kind of think about it. Ooh, is like we order something online, you know, like, ooh, is it here yet? Is it going to come? And like, did I get my tracking info? And we're looking in like 4 days, you know, every day or every hour. And it's like, did it change? Or is it still coming on Thursday? You know? And it's a similar thing where you don't think about it, you let it go. It's going to arrive when it arrives. And I thought that was a beautiful example and hilarious. I'm sorry about your cars. I recently spent some time out in Arizona and I didn't have a car. I come from a culture where I like that freedom of a car. Like I can go off at any point in time. And that was a good little surrendering for myself too, that, all right, I'll adapt. This is new circumstances. I'm going to be stationary more than I thought I would be, and using my legs a little bit more, but I'm all this in this hot desert. I can't really, I'm not going to like walk 30 miles somewhere. That's just not happening. And but like those, we build up all those little frameworks of ourselves, and that's the big thing that kind of let go. And like, and when we do that ceremony work, that's a part of it. We're stepping out of the ordinary into that non-ordinary. And when we garm our garments, our kind of ritualistic garments and things like that, that's all about putting on that mask, that shell, to go into this new phase of being. And that's a level of non-attachment, you know. And like all these little things are kind of rooted back to non-attachment. Like everything is sort of malleable, and not to be completely kind of fixated onto one concept. And then like, especially I know you have the hermetic background, and I always admire the great appreciation to different perspectives and finding your own way that kind of builds up your own personal cosmology that rings to your heart truth, you know. And that big thing, like, you know, I'm not a huge fan of like Aleister Crowley and stuff, but that was the big thing with Thelema, is kind of opening up to other ideological concepts outside of your ingrained little bubble. Because how do you know yourself if you're not yourself in these varying circumstances? So introducing varying perspectives and things that maybe that you don't, or were built, or like shattering your kind of ideological bubbles, you know. And I think that's super important for that breakthrough sort of energy, and also cohesively kind of forging together that inner self. Because when you're that witness or that anthropologist looking at varying cultures, you know, you're always that witness within circumstances that are fundamentally different, that reflect back that inner truth. Then you can kind of know, like, no, that's not me. This was more fantasy and whatever kind of illusionary sort of aspect that maybe I thought something was. So like it always puts you in more in tune to yourself. Even like trying new foods, trying new things, it switches you out of your comfort zone. And I feel like that kind of reflects back that level of inner self that leads to that self mastery. And
my Hermetic teacher's first training, which I needed so desperately, is the empty your cup. See, I can't pour any new stuff in if your old cup is so full, which it's like a quote that Madeline L'Engle used to say, if yourself is so full of yourself, there's no space to pour in the divine. And it's so very true. Our egos get so proud of whatever, our learning, our way of life, our understanding of the world, even things that things that are invisible to us because they have been so deeply ingrained on a subconscious level that it prevents us from growing. I mean, it literally prevents us from growing because we are so full. There is just no room to expand outward. And part of the magical process is to be able to empty your cup again and again and again. Adopt that beginner's mind. That's why it's so powerful, so that you can appreciate the ability to grow. And the amazing thing about the process is it doesn't matter how much practice you have. It's still something that we all have to remind ourselves of constantly. Because I guarantee you, if you're listening to me, there is a little part of you that is kicking just a little bit that doesn't apply to me. Oh, well, those other people need to let go of this, that, and the other thing. Me, not so much, because we all believe on some level that our vision of reality is primary. It's primary because we are, as Zaphod Beeblebrox used to say, the center of our own universe. And when you're the center of your own universe, of course you think everything else is peripheral or less than some way. And yet, it's that very notion that we are constantly learning how to release and soften. Because if we don't, we lose our ability to grow and change, and we lose our ability to create something new.
That was beautiful, Donna. And I had this image when you were talking about either in Hitchhikers when they have the little translator goldfish, or even Star Trek, the universal translators. And it feels like I speak in so much like this abstract, like I'm all over the place thought. And like you just have this beautiful way of like elegantly translating it into something that people can.
Because I quote Zaphod Beeblebrox? That's called pith.
Well, I appreciate it, but you're absolutely right. I mean, like, I was also thinking about the suit of the cups and the water metaphor, because I heard you talk about that quite a bit, and it's a beautiful one because it is true. You do have to kind of. This is also the back to non-attachment. Like we're always filled up with so much. Oh, I forgot I was going to mention that. Real quick, back before we get to the cups. The mentality of this constantly of and especially in the Western perspective that you mentioned, this hoarding aspect, right? We're constantly more and more not releasing back, is totally the Western perspective of the dragon. You know, so this is Smog sitting on the pile of gold, and this is like the scarcity mentality that's kind of bred from this constant greed and this insatiable sort of desire that just builds up, and then you're hoarding it. And that's an interesting parallel because like that's only a Western perspective of dragons. And then like you look in the Eastern perspective, you know, perfect for eclipse season, is all that it's the connecting of heaven and earth, spirit and matter, you know, and it's not latched on like that whole imagery of the dragging on the pile of gold is such a Western perspective. And it's very akin to having a full cup essentially. So you're absolutely, it's a beautiful thing. Like you need to like empty that cup because like every experience, every scenario, whether we're walking into a cafe that we've been to 1,000 times, is different. You're looking in a different moment, a unique, you know, snapshot of time So like being a non-attached in that context, you're opening up to that level of mystery that is just there, like the synchronistic flow. That's always a great sign post that, you know, you're on that. I feel like that you're on that magical channel, that train of thought. Like you see those little blips kind of come up all the time, and that really only happens if you're kind of, if you're just in that moment, heart open, and just walking around with non-attachment, just being open to life, open to that mystery. And you see that everywhere. You know, those signs just come screaming at you, and or in very subtle ways too. But it, yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
It is a hermetic dictum. It's also the dictum of Taoism and other philosophies that life exists as polarity. And so for everything that we posit, the opposite is also true. And that the challenge of life is to find the way where in between navigating those two extremes. And that's why it's so very hard for Westerners to even have these conversations, because today we talk about things that are polarized, such radical polarization in the US. And they've forgotten that even in Western culture, we have this embedded too. We just don't think about the yin and the yang. I mean, it was Socrates, I think, who talked about how to formulate ideas. You start with a thesis. Here's what could be true. And then you propose the antithesis, the opposite of the thesis. And then you take these 2 points and you try to navigate between them and find the synthesis. Synthesis is the coming together of your 2 points of view. And it's that fundamental philosophy that has to underscore everything. And if you want to go through every philosophy on the planet and try to find the best way to navigate the world, it's always going to come, the ideal way is always going to come down to that, not because it's my preference. It's just pure logic. Pure logic, because things can't exist without their opposite. It's kind of the definition of our three-dimensional world. And so finding a way to navigate the opposites, whether it's in politics or in religion or in your diet or whatever else, is usually the best way through any situation. Which means when we talk, we're so used to saying, I have this idea. Oh, wait, maybe that one's not quite right. And someone else argues, that we get caught in between the back and forth because we're attached to our own philosophy. And if we get so attached to our own philosophy, we can't go to that middle place. We can't get to the process, the synthesizing part, because we're not willing to grow beyond ourselves, give an inch as we go forward.
It's absolutely true, and it's just the same thing about you know, the every poison there has the antidote. And I always think about the polarities of the zodiac, and like there's always that key to one archetype is always in that reflective other. And I love that straddling those polarities leads to that middle path and that center of being. You're absolutely right. And yeah, it's fundamentally the same. If you think about, like, even if you go back to like this is cosmological nonsense in a way, because who knows, that creative moment of the universe, you know, that big bang, that scattering outward, then I always love the storylines of that collapse back inwards, right? But so the 2 poles, you know, branching outwards from that center, you know, they're coming together, they're, you know, starting from that ultimate center point, then branching out in both directions. So then when you're living on one pole and then observing the other pole, and you're going through all the varying differences and things like that, ultimately you come back to the same point. Like it comes back to the same center point, the same source. And then you realize that that's the unity of the poles itself. So the differences, yet the similarities, and they're all kind of joined together, and they're this fun little full circle Ouroboros journey of the mind.
Well, this is where I get to learning magic is the art of learning, grasping, and releasing. And it's the art of learning how to craft your own desires. And so that when you have intentions, you know they're what you want. Mm. And when they're not what you want anymore, you're okay with letting them go. Because, I mean, grasping, that's why I like the grasping and releasing. It's just easier for me to physically visualize in my head that if you're going to grasp something, you know, like monkey bars for the monkey mind, what happens if you don't let go? What are you going to do? Hang on the monkey bars the rest of your life? I mean, eventually you're going to have to let go of the bar.
So
and
true.
that's the parallel of we grasp and then we release. We grasp and then we release. And we need that for the mechanics of moving through life. And it's just, I think it's one of the flaws that's been created by the Western mindset of grow, 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 hold, that has created the ecological travesties that we find ourselves in, is that we using the words of, you know, Levi-Strauss and Derrida and all the postmodernists, we have a structure. We have this structural approach where maybe one point in time we recognized that you needed to grasp and release, but we have given the grasping part primacy. We've created this whole society that's taken this sense of polarity, and by structuring it and saying white is better than black, male is better than female, progress is better than being still, all of these things, and we are laden with them, and they become subconscious and drive all kinds of craziness in our world, especially when we get into the intersection of things. Well, what happens if, like, you know, maleness collides with another value over here of blackness or something? How does this fit into? So we keep trying to make this crazy hierarchical tree that makes no sense because it's not real. Mm-hmm. It's a construction, a structure in our heads. And part of the challenge we're facing right now is that we have people who don't fully appreciate that it's back to the level of, we talked about what it is to grasp in physical terms, but this is what we are grasping in mental terms. We are grasping onto the concept that our way of growing up was right. And you know what? Most of what we learned growing up, and it doesn't matter what culture you're from. Pick on some other culture than the United States. I just happen to live here in the United States. What we learned is totally arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary and not always useful. And yet, because we have internalized it, because it's become part of our expectations. God help us when our expectations are failed, because that illuminates where we were attached. I mean, when your expectations aren't met, you know you were attached to something. And
yeah, the veil of Maya.
It's whatever you thought was supposed to happen that didn't actually happen. And moving through this is hard, because it affects all of our soft little animal bits that like certainty and all those things. And yet, when you really do this kind of spiritual work, you have to keep going down to the bottom and realizing that at the very bottom, blank sheet, blank page. So, because that gets back to the whole Derrida's concept of, if we live in the structures, we have to deconstruct it. And if you keep deconstructing and deconstructing, what you get is utter stillness, non-being. And yet we have to live in between being and non-being, or we have a really hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I know.
I'd always had this horrible archaeological joke that I made up that Archaeologists, like, they're the only ones that can reach rock bottom and never know they're there because they keep on digging. And then sometimes I feel that way. But this is so true about we build up these intellectual frameworks, like you said. We pick on the US quite a bit because, hey. But it's true. We build up like these societal frameworks and completely indoctrinated. And then we're kind of like, go off like this is it. But then that moment comes of that whole dismantling. You got to completely deconstruct absolutely everything that you thought you have known, and then build those things back up into your own framework. And that's complete sovereignty. And that's like the power of like this kind of magical path, is that then you become like a unique individual, working with like Neo waking up in the Matrix, like all around you is this hallucinatory sort of world. And then you're coming back to that core truth, which is the divine birthright of everyone. It looks differently and like different ideological and religious and spiritual approaches, but they all lead to the same place. And that's that inner sovereignty, that inner light, that inner gnosis. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's like super empowering. And then life becomes this, like, I always bring back the anecdote. I don't get to paint as much as I used to, but that alchemical process of art making, whether you're taking a blank piece, even writing, anything, like a blank piece of paper or a blank canvas, that exists in its totality. That is an entity itself. That is a complete whole. And then what you're doing is shattering and destroying that blank canvas, even though in an act of creation, you're reusing it. You're actually creating this beautiful work of art and transmuting that blank page into something that is, not a blank page. And that is a whole process of non-attachment. Well, then like to Tibetan sand painting or losing a portfolio or having that stolen, that happened to me, was a level of non-attachment. And then giving art away or burning something, like, then what was the point? And people are like, oh, that's like, what are you doing that? Like, you need to like save this or latch on to this sort of this piece of work of art. But that's just not life too. Like it like, eventually all, star goes nova. So that whole
it's the hero's journey. I mean,
yeah.
The Matrix in Neo is a Gnostic tale. I mean,
Oh yeah.
For sure. I mean, even his name, Neo, new. That if you want to live that life, if you want to be the hero, you've got to be willing to walk away from whatever it is that keeps you small. And for some people, that's going to be walking away from the religion they were born into and to explore other things. For some people, it's going to be walking away from the culture they were born into. From some people, it's going to be, who knows? There's lots of possibilities because, again, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. But it's the definition of the hero to be able to move past whatever we are in, large or small, into something new that's part of the journey. And the question is, are you willing to take it?
Yeah, and then you don't know if like how far you've went, how that transmutation of the self until that return, and you go back and you're like, wow, that's not me anymore. And that's non-attachment too. I'm glad you brought up the Neo and the Matrix, because we're totally gonna have to do a sci-fi Gnostic episode one day and explore that, because there's so much good material. But Neo is also the new one. He's an anagram for 1, 2. So you got the new one going on, and he's cool. I got to go back to that, and we're gonna have more Matrix movies coming out, which is kind of fun. So I kind of want to go back to those. I haven't watched those in years.
I wonder if we can manifest a magic and mastery movie night.
That would be fantastic.
I bet we could. I actually took a class on the spiritual mechanics of the Matrix. Believe it or not.
That's fantastic. Well, there was great books written about that. That blew so many minds. It came at the perfect time, because this is a story that's obviously, it's been told over and over and over and over again. Then even like in the more modern era with like great sci-fi writers have been talking about this concept all the time, but it just hit in a way that was perfect for our culture and our timing, like any of this those kind of great cultural epics do. So it's always fun to see. And I remember like there's so many books written about it, and it was a beautiful thing. I think kind of opened up a lot of people to these concepts.
Okay, well, we have homework and you have homework because I know it's time for an experiment.
Well, I did mine yesterday, everyone.
Yeah, you get off the hook because you shaved your head. So our homework is to figure out if we could have movie night because that sounds like super fun. Bring the popcorn.
That would be great.
It is time for an experiment. And if you don't want to watch The Matrix, why don't you consider this? You just take a moment and look around your world and see how much you can recognize, how much all the physical stuff is stuff that you're holding on to and why. Are you grasping onto it? And if you are, then why? And maybe some of it can be released. But if you want to go a step further, do that in the space of what you believe. And really begin to maybe even take a piece of paper or a page out of your Book of Shadows journal. Write down some of what you consider your core beliefs. And ask yourselves, why do I believe this? And resist the temptation for your mind to rationalize some logical explanation of why you believe what you believe. And really sit with it and say, is this an essential belief? Do I actually need this? And you might recognize that you don't need as many things as you're carrying around in your physical world or in your mental world. You might end up lightening the load, which, given eclipse season, seems like the appropriate thing to do. What do you think of that, Chris, as an
I think it's beautiful, and Uranus and Saturn may be doing that for us. Super important.
We didn't want to mention them. They might hear us.
Shall not be named. Exactly. No, I think it's good. I love that concept. And yes, I did my homework already. Did that. And I've been purging, throwing things out, getting ready for a move. And it's important. It's a good reminder.
If you like these kinds of experiments, I highly recommend that you check out my Magic and Mastery Coven. We have classes on all kinds of things, from divination to how you can reach your highest potential to magic and more. You can find out more about it at www.magicandmastery.com/coven. All right. Well, Chris, thank you very much for doing this episode with me. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, don't forget to check out the show notes at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast and find out all the good stuff. It's going to take me a while to find all the links for this one, but I will make sure that they are in the episode. And please don't forget to take a moment to rate and review this podcast wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast. We love your feedbacks because that helps us figure out how to bring you more of the good stuff. And if you liked it, why don't you share it with a friend?